The morning sun painted diagonal stripes across the kitchen table where Rachel Morrison set down 2 coffee mugs, the ceramic cool against her palms despite the warmth building outside. It was April 2009, and the cherry tree in the backyard had bloomed early that year, scattering white petals across the grass like confetti after a celebration no one had planned. She could hear her son Ethan moving around upstairs, the familiar creak of the 3rd step from the top, the rush of water through old pipes. On the counter sat his backpack, forest green with fraying straps, stuffed with textbooks for his afternoon shift at the library, where he shelved returns and helped elderly patrons navigate the computer catalogue. Beside it lay his red high-top sneakers, the ones he'd saved up for months to buy, bright as stop signs, laces perpetually half-tied the way 19-year-olds wore them. He came down wearing his favorite grey hoodie, the one with the university logo he'd bought at orientation the previous fall. At 19, Ethan had his father's steady hands and his mother's quick smile, though lately Rachel noticed he smiled less, his attention drifting during dinner conversations, his phone buzzing with messages he'd glance at and quickly dismiss. The house smelled of coffee and toast, ordinary morning smells that would later become unbearable in their ordinariness. Still, he kissed her cheek that morning, grabbed an apple from the bowl, and slipped on those red sneakers, not bothering to tie them properly. He told her he'd be home by 6. The screen door clapped shut behind him with its familiar wooden thud. She watched through the window as he walked to the bus stop, those red shoes visible beneath his jeans like flares guiding him forward. And then he turned the corner and disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of a Thursday morning that would stretch into 12 years of silence. By 7 that evening, Rachel's calls went straight to voicemail. By 9, she'd driven to the library, the community college, the coffee shop where Ethan sometimes studied. His manager said he'd never showed for his shift. His roommate at the college dorms said Ethan had mentioned meeting someone but hadn't specified who. Rachel felt the first flutter of real fear then, something beyond annoyance or concern, a primal recognition that the world had shifted in some fundamental way. The police report filed that night documented a missing 19-year-old male, 5'10", dark blonde hair, hazel eyes, last seen wearing grey hoodie and distinctive red high-top sneakers. No history of running away, no apparent crisis, no warning signs that anyone had noticed. If you've ever wondered how families navigate the impossible space between hope and grief, or how investigations piece together lives from fragments and dead ends, subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story spans more countries and harder truths than you might expect. The first 48 hours moved with the frantic energy of crisis, that adrenaline-fueled suspension of normal life when everything becomes search and strategy. Rachel and her ex-husband David printed flyers with Ethan's face, that smile that now seemed almost accusatory in its innocence, the school photo from senior year because they didn't have anything more recent that captured him properly. They plastered them on telephone poles, bus shelters, grocery store bulletin boards, coffee shop windows. Neighbors formed search parties that combed the wooded park near campus, calling his name until their voices went hoarse, beating through underbrush, checking behind dumpsters and under bridges, all the terrible places you imagine when someone you love disappears. Police interviewed his professors, his co-workers at the library, the sparse collection of friends who described Ethan as quiet, reliable, maybe a little private but not withdrawn, not struggling in any visible way, not the type to simply vanish. His professors said he'd been attending classes regularly, his grades solid if unspectacular. His co-workers said he'd seemed normal at his last shift, maybe a little distracted but nothing alarming. Everyone agreed Ethan was responsible, thoughtful, not impulsive, not the kind of kid who'd take off without telling anyone, which made his absence all the more incomprehensible, all the more frightening in its apparent randomness. The promising lead came on day 5. A gas station attendant 3 towns over remembered a young man matching Ethan's description buying energy drinks and asking for directions to the interstate. Security footage showed a figure in a grey hoodie, but the angle was wrong, the face obscured by the hood and the camera's limited resolution. They ran the timestamp against Ethan's phone records and found nothing. The signal from his cell had gone dead the afternoon he disappeared, last pinging off a tower near campus before vanishing as completely as its owner. Police checked the footage again, focusing on the shoes, but the image quality couldn't confirm whether they were red high tops or something else entirely. It wasn't him at the gas station. The search widened anyway, hope attaching itself to any possibility, however thin, however desperate. Rachel stopped sleeping in any meaningful way. She'd lie in bed listening to the house settle, every creak a potential footstep, every distant car a possible return. She kept Ethan's room exactly as he'd left it, his laptop open on the desk, still showing his last browser tabs, his laundry still in the hamper waiting to be washed, those red sneakers twin pair, his backup set, sitting by his closet like they were waiting for him too. She'd find herself standing in the doorway at 2 in the morning, trying to decode the space for clues she'd somehow missed, searching his bookshelf, his desk drawers, his closet for some hidden message, some explanation for where he'd gone and why. David, steady David, who'd always been the practical one even after their divorce, started a spreadsheet tracking every tip, every sighting, every dead end. He called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, filed reports with multiple databases, learned terminology he'd never wanted to know: NCIC, NamUs, DOE Network, VICAP. He researched protocols, jurisdictional boundaries, the difference between a missing person and a runaway in legal terms. He made spreadsheets of search areas, timelines, possible scenarios. It was his way of maintaining control when everything felt uncontrollable, of finding patterns when chaos seemed the only constant. The detective assigned to the case, a woman named Jennifer Cole with tired eyes and a patient voice that suggested she'd walked this terrible road with too many families, explained the reality they were facing. Young adults sometimes left deliberately, she said gently, her words careful but honest. Family conflict, relationship troubles, mental health crises, opportunities that seemed urgent in the moment, the overwhelming feeling of being trapped that could make disappearing feel like the only option. Most returned within days or weeks. Some didn't want to be found. Rachel insisted Ethan wasn't running from anything, but how well do we ever really know the interior landscape of another person, even our own children, even the boy we'd raised and thought we understood? Detective Cole requested Ethan's financial records, medical history, social media passwords, everything that might illuminate his state of mind or his movements. They found nothing alarming, no large withdrawals suggesting planning, no concerning searches about disappearing or starting over or ending things, no farewell posts hidden in drafts, no credit card charges after the day he vanished. His bank account showed routine transactions, coffee shops, textbooks, gas for the car he shared with his roommate. Then nothing. Silence as total as his physical absence. Weeks collapsed into months with the peculiar acceleration of time during crisis. The cherry blossoms fell and returned and fell again. Rachel attended support groups for families of the missing, sitting in church basements on metal folding chairs, listening to stories that mirrored her own in their helpless horror. Some families had been waiting 5 years, 10 years, 20. They shared strategies for managing the ambiguous loss, that peculiar grief without closure, the person both gone and somehow still present in every photograph, every birthday that passed uncelebrated, every Christmas stocking hung out of stubborn hope or ritual necessity. She kept Ethan's phone active, paying the bill each month in case he ever turned it on, in case a single bar of battery remained somewhere and he reached out. David hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Thomas Webb, who worked missing persons cases with the methodical patience they required. Webb worked the case for 18 months, following up every tip, re-interviewing witnesses, checking and rechecking surveillance footage from businesses near campus. He found nothing. No credit card activity, no social security number usage. No arrests, no hospital admissions, no John Does matching Ethan's description in any morgue across the tri-state area, then expanding nationwide. It was as if he'd stepped through a door into somewhere the usual infrastructure of modern life couldn't reach, couldn't track, couldn't illuminate. The financial strain was crushing but unspoken between Rachel and David. She refinanced the house to cover investigator fees, the cost of flyers and rewards, and consultations with specialists who promised expertise but delivered mostly educated guesses. David burned through savings on age progression services that created computer-generated images of what Ethan might look like at 25, at 30, aging him forward through years he should have been living. They paid for consultations with forensic specialists, with psychics in desperate moments they didn't discuss afterward, with the slim hope that DNA submitted to every database might someday trigger a match against unidentified remains or amnesia cases. They attended vigils for other missing persons, understanding now that they were part of a vast, invisible population, families suspended in the terrible waiting, unable to move forward but unable to let go. They learned the statistics. Hundreds of thousands of missing persons reports filed each year, most resolved quickly, but tens of thousands that remained open, mysteries that aged into cold cases, names that became database entries rather than breathing people. They learned to recognize other families in grocery stores, at gas stations, people carrying the same haunted look, the same combination of exhaustion and vigilance. Detective Cole called periodically with updates that rarely contained new information. The case had gone cold, but remained open. She explained how these investigations worked in the long term. Periodic reviews when new detectives rotated in, cross-referencing against unidentified remains as they were found, monitoring for activity in government databases, watching for the kinds of patterns that might indicate someone living under the radar or using false identification. She was kind but realistic. Most long-term missing persons cases, when resolved, ended in one of two ways: remains discovered years later, or voluntary disappearances confirmed when the person eventually resurfaced or was found living elsewhere under different circumstances. Rachel learned about the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, about how DNA samples could sit waiting for years until genealogy technology advanced enough to reveal connections invisible to earlier methods. She submitted Ethan's toothbrush, his hairbrush, anything that might contain genetic material, to every database that would accept it. She learned about forensic genealogy, about how investigative genetic genealogy had solved decades-old cases by comparing DNA to commercial ancestry databases, building family trees backward to identify unidentified remains. She learned more about death and identification than any parent should have to learn. In year 3, Rachel started a blog documenting Ethan's case, posting updates, sharing memories, keeping his story alive in the public consciousness. Other families reached out with their own stories, forming a community bound by shared trauma. In year 4, she testified at a state legislative hearing about improving missing persons databases and interagency cooperation. In year 5, she took a leave of absence from her teaching job because she couldn't focus on lesson plans when her son was somewhere unknown, possibly hurt, possibly in need of help she couldn't provide. David threw himself into work, the accounting projects that had clear solutions and predictable outcomes, so unlike the chaos of their personal lives. But Rachel noticed the weight he'd lost, the grey in his hair that seemed to spread overnight, the way his hands shook slightly when he called with another dead-end lead. The divorce had been amicable years before Ethan disappeared, both of them acknowledging they'd grown into different people who wanted different lives. But this tragedy rebound them in unwanted partnership, two people navigating grief's strange territory together because no one else could understand the specific texture of their loss. In year 7, a social worker in Phoenix called with a potential match. A young man with amnesia, found wandering downtown, approximately the right age and description, unable to provide any identifying information. Rachel and David flew out within hours, their hearts hammering with a hope so intense it felt dangerous, like something that could stop their hearts if disappointed. The waiting room at the hospital smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. When they finally saw him, the young man had kind eyes and no memory of his name, but Rachel knew immediately. Something in the bone structure was wrong, the angle of his jaw, the shape of his ears. When the DNA comparison came back 3 days later, it confirmed what she'd already sensed. This wasn't Ethan. He was someone else's missing son. The social worker apologized, though none of it was her fault. Rachel held the stranger's hand anyway and told him she hoped he found his way home, whoever he was, wherever he'd come from. On the flight back, she and David didn't speak much. There were too many disappointments by then to process each one individually. They'd become cumulative, a weight that made breathing harder, made hope more difficult to sustain, made the prospect of one more year of not knowing almost unbearable. The 8th and 9th years blurred together. Rachel functioned but didn't live. She went through motions, grocery shopping, bill paying, holiday dinners with relatives who'd stopped asking about Ethan because what was there to say anymore? David remarried, a kind woman named Susan who tried to be supportive but could never fully understand. Rachel dated briefly, a widower from her church group, but explaining Ethan felt impossible and hiding him felt like betrayal. She existed in the liminal space between widow and mother, claimed by neither category, defined by absence rather than presence. The 10th anniversary of Ethan's disappearance passed with a small gathering organized by the local missing persons advocacy group. Rachel spoke briefly, her voice steady from practice, about keeping hope alive, about never giving up, about the importance of updating databases and supporting families in crisis. The local news ran a 2-minute segment showing Ethan's age progression photo, now estimating him at 29 years old. David submitted the case for review to a non-profit that specialized in cold investigations, hoping fresh eyes might catch something everyone else had missed. They found nothing new. In year 11, David had a heart attack, massive, sudden, fatal before the ambulance arrived. Rachel got the call from Susan, devastated Susan who'd known David only 5 years but loved him completely. At the funeral, Rachel stood by the casket thinking about how David would never know what happened to Ethan, would die with that question unanswered, that wound unhealed. It seemed impossibly cruel, this double loss, grief compounding grief, until the weight felt unsurvivable. She cleaned out David's office after Susan asked for help, unable to face it alone. In filing cabinets and desk drawers, Rachel found every document related to Ethan's case. Police reports, investigator notes, newspaper clippings, printed emails, the evolution of a mystery across 11 years. David had kept searching even when it seemed hopeless, kept paying for database subscriptions and investigator hours until his death. Rachel boxed it all up, took it home, and added it to her own archive, the physical manifestation of years spent in terrible suspension. Then, in March 2021, 12 years after that Thursday morning, Rachel's phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, trained by years of disappointment to expect nothing, but something made her pick up. The voice on the other end was deeper than she remembered, but unmistakably familiar in its cadence, in the way it shaped vowels, in the slight pause before speaking that had always been Ethan's habit when he was gathering his thoughts. "Mom," he said, and the word cracked in the middle like something breaking. "It's me. I'm finally home." The room tilted. Rachel sat down hard on the kitchen chair, the same chair where she'd sat 12 years ago drinking coffee while Ethan moved around upstairs. Her vision narrowed to a pinpoint and then expanded too wide, taking in too much light. She heard herself asking questions, her voice strange in her own ears. "Where are you? Are you hurt? Are you safe?" Ethan's answers came haltingly. "Portland, Oregon. I'm okay. I'm at a police station. I want to come home." The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, because people who disappeared for 12 years didn't just call and say they were coming home. Detective Cole coordinated with Portland PD, setting up protocols, managing expectations, explaining carefully that verification would take time. Rachel called Susan, who cried with her, who understood what David would have felt in this moment, the relief and anger and confusion that would have overwhelmed him. Rachel booked a flight for the next morning, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to process the possibility that 12 years of nightmare might actually be ending. The reunion happened at a police station in Portland, a neutral space chosen by the social services coordinator managing the case. "Standard protocol for long-term missing persons returns," they explained, especially when circumstances remained unclear. Rachel saw him through a window first, standing beside a detective, taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader, his hair longer, his face carrying lines that hadn't existed at 19. He wore clothes she didn't recognize, a blue jacket and jeans, regular sneakers, black this time, not red. 12 years of life she knew nothing about, 12 years of experiences and changes, and becoming someone she'd never met. When they brought her into the room, protocol required them to confirm identity before any contact. Photographs could be misleading, memory unreliable, hope transformative in dangerous ways. She found herself staring at this man who was and wasn't her son, searching his features for the boy who'd kissed her cheek and grabbed an apple and disappeared into 12 years of nothing. He had Ethan's eyes, that particular shade of hazel, but the expression in them was different, guarded and sad and something else she couldn't name. He had Ethan's hands, long-fingered like his father's, but they moved differently now, more carefully, like someone accustomed to measuring gestures. "Ethan," she said, and he nodded, and something in the nod was unmistakably him. That particular tilt of his head he'd had since childhood. But protocol held them apart, required the DNA test that would take 3 days to process, though genetic genealogy services could have done it faster. They were being thorough because the story Ethan told raised immediate questions that needed answering before reunification could proceed unsupervised. He said he'd been living in Southeast Asia, teaching English, traveling, losing touch gradually and then completely. His phone had been destroyed in an accident early on, he said. His documents stolen. His path so far removed from American infrastructure that coming back had seemed increasingly impossible until it suddenly seemed necessary. He'd flown into Los Angeles, made his way north, and called the moment he had access to a working phone, and could remember the number, his mother's number, unchanged in 12 years. Rachel wanted to believe him. She wanted to collapse into the relief that he was alive, that 12 years of nightmare had ended, that her son had come home even if he'd changed, even if he'd been gone impossibly long. But Detective Cole, gentle as ever, explained they needed to verify his account before reunification could proceed unsupervised. It was standard procedure. It was for everyone's protection. It was necessary because long-term disappearances sometimes involved complicated circumstances, coercion, mental health crises, criminal activity, trafficking, identity issues that required professional intervention. The passport office ran the trail and found records that didn't quite align with the timeline Ethan described. He'd left the country 3 weeks after his disappearance, crossing into Canada first with his valid US passport, then flying to Thailand from Vancouver International Airport. His passport showed stamps from a dozen countries across Southeast Asia and South Asia: Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, Indonesia, India, Nepal, Malaysia, Laos. He'd been moving, certainly, but he'd also been documenting his movements through official channels, renewing his passport twice through US embassies abroad, once in Bangkok in 2014 and again in New Delhi in 2019. The records were meticulous, undeniable, devastating in their clarity. Ethan hadn't lost his documents. He'd maintained them carefully across 12 years. He hadn't been unable to contact home. He'd been in cities with internet cafes, embassies, phone services, countless opportunities to send a message, make a call, end the agony of his family's not knowing. He'd been living his life while they'd been suspended in terrible limbo, while his father had died, believing his son might be dead too. In the interview room where they tried to reconcile his story with the evidence, Ethan's composure cracked. The room was small, painted institutional beige, furnished with a table and chairs designed for durability rather than comfort. Detective Cole sat beside Rachel, not as an adversary, but as a witness, someone trained to navigate these complicated returns. Ethan sat across from them, his hands folded on the table, and Rachel noticed his nails were bitten short, a habit from childhood she'd thought he'd outgrown. He admitted he hadn't lost touch accidentally. The words came slowly, painfully, like extracting splinters. He'd left deliberately, he said. At 19, he'd been overwhelmed by expectations he couldn't articulate, by a future that felt predetermined and suffocating, by the weight of being the son his parents needed him to be, rather than whoever he actually was. He'd been struggling with depression, with questions about his identity and his place in the world, with feelings he didn't have language for, and fears he couldn't voice. Running had seemed like the only option, the only way to breathe, the only way to figure out who he was, away from everyone's expectations and disappointments. At 21, coming back had seemed impossible, the gap too wide, the hurt he'd caused too deep to repair. He'd sent one email to his father's work address, he said, a message that explained nothing but confirmed he was alive. David had never mentioned receiving it. Rachel would later find it in David's email archive. 3 lines saying only that Ethan was safe and asked not to be searched for, sent 2 years into his disappearance. David had kept it to himself, perhaps to protect Rachel from renewed hope. Perhaps because he didn't know what to do with information that confirmed their son was alive, but still refusing contact. At 25, Ethan said, he'd built a life abroad that felt authentic but untethered, teaching English in small cities where no one knew his history, where he could be whoever he decided to be each morning. He'd made friends, relationships, connections, but always kept them surface level, always held back the truth of where he'd come from and what he'd done. At 31, his father's death, discovered through an old friend's social media post that someone had tagged him in, had finally broken through the paralysis. He'd seen the funeral announcement, seen his mother's face in the photo, and realized with sudden, crushing clarity that time was finite, that opportunities for repair didn't last forever, that running had solved nothing and cost everything. Rachel absorbed this sitting across a table in a room designed for difficult conversations. Her son had not been kidnapped, not trafficked, not lost to some terrible accident beyond anyone's control. He had chosen to leave. He had chosen, every day for 12 years, not to call, not to send a postcard beyond that single email, not to alleviate the agony of her waiting. He had chosen himself over her, over David, over every person who'd loved him and searched for him and mourned him while he was alive and building a different life. The grief she'd carried had been real, but its object had been alive and willfully silent across the world. The distinction felt important and devastating in equal measure. She thought about the refinanced house, the savings account drained to zero, the careers sacrificed, the relationships that couldn't survive the weight of her loss. She thought about David dying with that unanswered question, the wondering that probably contributed to the stress that stopped his heart. She thought about 12 years of her life spent in suspended animation while Ethan had been making choices, having experiences, living. The anger came then, volcanic and purifying. How dare he, she thought. How dare he sit there with his bitten nails and his careful apologies, and expect her to welcome him back like nothing had happened, like 12 years was a minor inconvenience rather than a lifetime of agony. How dare he choose himself so completely while they'd chosen him every day, searching for him, hoping for him, refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier. But underneath the anger was something more complicated. Relief that he was alive, grief for the years lost, confusion about how to feel about any of it. Detective Cole let the silence stretch, trained to understand that these reunions needed time, needed space for all the complicated emotions to surface and be acknowledged. The legal consequences were minimal. Ethan hadn't committed fraud or evaded any outstanding warrants. He was an adult who'd exercised his right to disappear, however cruel the exercise had been to those left behind. Missing persons weren't automatically wanted persons unless other crimes were involved. He'd filed taxes in some years through foreign earned income exemptions, maintained legal status in the countries where he'd worked, violated no laws beyond the moral crime of abandonment, which wasn't actually criminal. But the psychological consequences would take years to untangle. A family therapist specializing in reconnection after estrangement, recommended by the social services coordinator, explained that Rachel and Ethan were essentially strangers now, bound by history, but separated by more than a decade of independent development. Trust would have to be rebuilt from nothing if it could be rebuilt at all. Boundaries would need establishing. Expectations required recalibration. Forgiveness was possible, but not mandatory, not immediate, not something anyone could demand or expect. Rachel found herself holding one of the old flyers, the paper yellowed and creased from years in her desk drawer. Ethan's 19-year-old face smiled up at her, frozen in a moment before choice, before consequence, before the decision that would define both their lives for more than a decade. She thought about the red sneakers he'd been wearing, how she'd described them to police, to journalists, to anyone who might help bring him home. Those shoes had become iconic in her mind, a symbol of the last normal moment, the last time she'd seen her son and believed the world made sense. In the apartment where Ethan had been staying temporarily, a short-term rental, while he figured out his next steps, she noticed a pair of red high tops on the floor by the door, new but deliberately chosen in that same bright color, the same style he'd worn at 19. He saw her looking and said quietly that he'd bought them at the airport in LA, that he'd been trying to reconnect with the person he'd been, that he knew it didn't fix anything, but he'd wanted to signal some continuity, some acknowledgement that he remembered who he'd been, even as he'd become someone different. The gesture felt simultaneously touching and infuriating. Red sneakers couldn't undo 12 years. They couldn't bring back David or repair the damage or make any of this okay. But they suggested Ethan understood, on some level, what he'd done, what he'd taken, what could never be recovered, no matter how much anyone wanted it back. They met for coffee twice before attempting anything longer. Neutral locations, coffee shops with exits close by, time limits agreed upon in advance. Ethan talked about teaching children in rural Thailand, about monasteries in Myanmar, where he'd stayed during particularly dark periods, about finding peace in movement and anonymity, about learning to meditate and cook and navigate foreign bureaucracies. Rachel talked about the support groups, the anniversaries marked with vigils, the age progression images she'd kept on her phone, updating them each year to imagine what he might look like, trying to keep his face current in her mind so she'd recognize him if she ever saw him. They were careful with each other, both aware of how fragile this reconnection was, how easy it would be to say the wrong thing and shatter whatever was being tentatively rebuilt. The therapist had warned them about common pitfalls: pushing too fast, avoiding necessary conflict, pretending the past didn't matter, demanding too much too soon. They were learning to communicate as new people rather than resuming roles that no longer fit either of them. The truth that emerged through months of careful therapy sessions was complicated and human in ways that resisted simple narrative. Ethan had been struggling with depression and identity questions he hadn't known how to voice in a family and community where such struggles weren't discussed openly. Running had been both escape and self-punishment, a way to avoid disappointing people by preemptively removing himself from their lives, by failing catastrophically rather than incrementally. The years abroad had given him space to become someone he could live with, but they'd also entrenched the avoidance, making return feel more impossible with each passing year, the debt of hurt he'd caused growing beyond any ability to repay. David's death had finally broken the cycle, forcing Ethan to confront the reality that time was finite, that death was permanent in ways disappearance wasn't, that opportunities for repair didn't last forever. He'd realized, too late for his father, that being alive but absent was its own kind of death, that the protection he'd thought he was offering by staying away was actually just cowardice dressed up as consideration. Rachel grieved her ex-husband newly, imagining how David would have reacted to Ethan's return, the relief and anger and confusion he would have felt. She grieved the 12 years she couldn't recover, the birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings that were simply gone, dissolved into time like those cherry blossoms that fell every spring. She grieved the version of Ethan who'd kissed her cheek at 19, understanding now that he was gone as completely as if he'd actually died, that the man who'd returned was someone different, shaped by experiences she'd never shared, choices she'd never witnessed. But she also began to understand, slowly, reluctantly, that grief and relief could coexist, that having Ethan alive and willing to reconnect was a gift, however complicated, however much work it would require, however much anger she still carried. Understanding didn't equal forgiveness, and forgiveness wouldn't equal forgetting, but it was something, a starting point, a foundation on which they might eventually build something that resembled a relationship, even if it could never be what they'd had before. The non-profit that had supported Rachel through the years asked if she'd be willing to speak about her experience at their annual conference. She agreed, standing before a room of families still waiting, still searching, still suspended in the terrible not knowing. She told them Ethan's return hadn't been the reunion she'd imagined, that it had brought new pain even as it resolved the primary question of his survival. She told them about the passport trail, about the 12 years of deliberate absence, about the anger and grief that coexisted with relief. She told them that knowing was better than not knowing, even when the truth was harder than any fiction she'd imagined, but that knowing came with its own challenges, its own griefs, its own difficult reckonings. She talked about the importance of mental health resources for young adults, about creating spaces where people could express doubt and fear and confusion without judgment or shame, about recognizing the signs of crisis before it became catastrophe. She talked about the need for better systems, for more coordination between databases, for protocols that might flag long-term disappearances even when the missing person was alive and moving through the world by choice. She talked about supporting families through reunion as well as loss, understanding that both required resources, guidance, professional help to navigate successfully. She mentioned the advocacy work she'd started with lawmakers, pushing for better coordination between missing persons databases and passport systems, for alerts when missing persons renewed documents or crossed borders, for systems that recognized that some disappearances were voluntary but still deserved intervention, still required family notification, still needed addressing rather than ignoring. She talked about the gap in services for families dealing with voluntary disappearances, how all the resources focused on trafficking and abduction, but nothing existed for the more common reality of people who chose to leave and the families left behind to cope with that abandonment. Ethan attended one of these talks, sitting in the back row, listening to his mother transform their story into something useful for others. Afterward, he approached her carefully, waiting until the crowd had thinned, until other families had finished asking their questions and sharing their stories. She saw in his face the cost of what he'd done, the weight he'd been carrying across continents, the specific pain of knowing you've hurt someone irreparably, and having to live with that knowledge, having to see its effects reflected in the person you'd hurt most. They didn't hug. They weren't there yet, might never be there again. But they stood together in the lobby, while other families approached with their own stories, their own questions, their own desperate hope that disappearance could be reversed, that time could be recovered, that love could survive the impossible. Rachel introduced Ethan when appropriate, watching him navigate conversations with people who saw him as miraculous, as proof that returns were possible, as evidence that giving up was never the right choice. She saw how it cost him to be held up as success story when the reality was so much more complicated, so much less triumphant than outsiders imagined. Rachel keeps a photo on her mantle now, a recent one, Ethan and her at a park in spring, cherry blossoms drifting down around them like they did that last morning 12 years ago. They'd gone there deliberately, choosing the location for its symbolic weight, trying to reclaim it from memory's grip. His sneakers in the photo are red. He's smiling, but it's different from the 19-year-old smile on those old flyers, more cautious, more earned, weighted with knowledge of what smiles can cost and what they can't fix. She looks at it sometimes and feels the full complexity of their situation, the joy that he's alive, the grief for what was lost, the slow, uncertain work of building something new from the wreckage of what had been, the knowledge that some breaks never fully heal, but can be lived with, can be accommodated, can be integrated into the larger story of survival. In the end, what Rachel learned is that not all disappearances end in tragedy, but neither do they necessarily end in triumph. Some end in the messy middle space of real life, where people make terrible choices and live with the consequences, where families fracture and sometimes partially mend, where closure is less a destination than an ongoing practice of acceptance and adaptation. Ethan returned, yes, but return isn't the same as restoration. It's a beginning, not an ending. The first difficult step on a path that might lead somewhere worth traveling, or might lead nowhere at all. No guarantees, no promises, just the daily choice to keep trying or to stop. Both options valid, both costly in their own ways. If your family is navigating the aftermath of a missing person case, whether through reunion or continued uncertainty, resources exist to help. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children maintains a family support network connecting families with counselors who understand ambiguous loss. The National Alliance on Mental Illness offers guidance for families dealing with mental health crises that might precipitate disappearances. And therapists specializing in ambiguous loss and family estrangement can provide frameworks for processing these uniquely challenging situations, for understanding that grief without death has its own texture, its own requirements, its own timeline that refuses to be rushed. Rachel still pays for Ethan's old phone number, though he has a new one now, a new life he's building slowly in the same city where his mother has always lived. He works at a community college teaching ESL classes, his 12 years abroad qualifying him in ways formal credentials couldn't. She doesn't know if they'll ever fully reconcile, if trust can be rebuilt after such a profound violation, if she can truly forgive the choice he made at 19 that cost her 12 years of peace. But she shows up for the scheduled coffee meetings, the supervised conversations, the gradual expansion of contact that the therapist recommends. She shows up because he came back, however imperfectly, and because showing up is all any of us can really do in the face of hurt that can't be undone, only acknowledged, only slowly integrated into the larger story of who we are and what we survive and how we choose, despite everything, to keep loving the people who've wounded us most deeply. The red sneakers still sit by Ethan's door, a small bridge across an enormous distance, proof that some things can be chosen again even when they can't be recovered. That return, however incomplete, matters in ways we're still learning to measure.